The Tower of London was cold that winter, the kind of cold that gnawed through wool and bone, that lived in the breath of every stone. The walls seemed to sweat with centuries of secrets, the damp exhalations of ghosts who had never left. Outside her chamber, boots crunched over frost, their rhythm a slow, inevitable march toward the gallows of dawn. Inside, the air was heavy with candle smoke and the faint tang of iron. A single flame shivered in the draught, its light catching on the worn grain of a block of oak placed squarely in the center of the room. Before it knelt a 19-year-old girl, her hands pale and trembling only from the cold. Her fingers moved over the wood as if memorizing every groove, every scar left by those who had come before her. She lowered her head, the nape of her neck bared to the empty room. She lifted it again, lowered, lifted, over and over, the rhythm of surrender practiced into muscle memory. She was not rehearsing death itself. She was rehearsing her control over it. If she could not change her fate, she could at least master the moment it claimed her. She was not just any prisoner. She was Catherine Howard, Queen of England, for less than 2 years. By law, she still carried the title. By sunrise, she would carry nothing at all. Beyond the tower walls, the Thames groaned beneath its armor of ice, dark water shifting under a frozen skin. The city slept under a brittle sky, oblivious to the fact that a royal death had already been signed, sealed, and set into motion. In the flicker of candlelight, her face betrayed no hysteria, no frantic bargaining with the heavens. The court had known her as a girl of laughter and silk, but here, on the edge of annihilation, she was something else entirely. A stillness carved in flesh and bone, the calm determination of someone who refused to let fear write the final line of her story. What crime could demand such an end for someone so young? Not merely adultery, not merely treason, but the greater, unspoken sin of being young, beautiful, and expendable in the court of Henry VIII. A court where a woman's smile could crown her at dawn and her silence could see her bled into the straw by the next. Tomorrow, she would kneel before the block one final time, and this time the wood would drink her last breath. This time, she would not rise. Part 1. A girl raised in shadows. Long before she was a queen, Catherine Howard was a child lost in the echoing halls of a noble house too sprawling to care for her. Born around 1523 into the mighty Howard family, a name that could bend courtiers to silence and tilt the balance of power in England, she should have been guarded like a jewel. She should have been taught the languages of diplomacy, the art of restraint, the careful steps of survival at court. Instead, she was a child without a compass. Her father, impoverished by gambling and mismanagement, died when she was young, leaving debts instead of dowries. Her mother was gone soon after. Orphaned in all but name, Catherine was dispatched to the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a woman whose grandeur had long outlived her patience for the duties of a guardian. Chesworth House, the Dowager's sprawling residence, should have been a sanctuary of refinement and discipline. But the reality was something else entirely. The old woman's attention was fixed on her own affairs, leaving the education of the girls in her care to chance and convenience. The dormitory was crowded with young women, noble daughters, wards of the Duchess, distant cousins sent to learn courtly manners. At night, their whispers slid through the dark like silverfish in the walls. They spoke of men, of kisses stolen in the orchard, of the thrill of slipping a letter beneath a door without being seen. By candlelight, they learned the subtle languages of glances and laughter, the silent grammar of seduction and secrecy. In this hothouse of intrigue, Catherine's education in survival began. She learned that a pretty face could open locked doors, that a tilt of the head could turn a lecture into a gift. The rules of the dormitory were unwritten but absolute. Keep the Duchess unbothered, keep each other's secrets, and never, ever be caught. She was 13 when her music teacher, Henry VIII, began to pay her the kind of attention that curled around her like smoke. He was older, practiced in the art of suggestion, and his lessons soon stretched beyond the strings of a lute. He taught her to time her smiles like notes in a melody, to mask a glance with feigned disinterest, to fold a private world within four walls and lock it from the inside. When that game burned out, there was Francis Derham, younger, hungrier, and far more dangerous. With him, it was not stolen moments in the music room, but entire hours hidden away, gifts wrapped in silk and tucked into linen chests, and whispered vows spoken with the certainty of youth. They called each other husband and wife, as though saying it could make it true. In those days, the danger seemed a distant, almost romantic shadow, but shadows in the Tudor world had teeth. What Catherine thought were harmless rebellions, the experiments of a young girl learning her own power, would not fade with time. They would follow her, stalk her, and one day return sharpened into weapons aimed directly at her neck. Part 2. The Howard Gambit. By 1540, the Tudor court was a glittering battlefield, all jewels and silks on the surface, but beneath it, a nest of factions sharpening invisible blades. Survival was not about loyalty, but about reading the king's mood before it turned lethal. One day's favorite could be the next day's prisoner in the Tower. Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince who had once dazzled Europe. Now in his late 40s, he moved with a stiff, lumbering gait, the ulcer in his leg oozing and reeking through layers of linen and perfumed salves. His once athletic frame had thickened into something monstrous, the weight of his own body an enemy he could not escape. Yet, in his mind, he was still a king who deserved beauty, youth, and devotion. His fourth marriage, a political union to Anne of Cleves, had been doomed before it began. The moment Henry first laid eyes on her, his face had soured. He called her his Flanders mare with cruel casualness, a nickname that spread through the court like spilled wine. The marriage had never been consummated. The king could barely bring himself to speak to her, let alone share her bed. For the Howard family, this was not misfortune. It was opportunity dressed in velvet. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a man whose ambition was rivaled only by his instinct for survival, saw the fracture and moved to wedge it wider. The plan was dangerous but elegant. Place his young, captivating niece directly in the king's line of sight and let nature, or rather Henry's appetites, do the rest. Catherine was 17, a girl with laughter in her eyes and a warmth that seemed untouched by the cold currents of court politics. The Duke secured her a position as a maid of honor to Queen Anne of Cleves. It was a calculated placement, close enough to serve the Queen, but closer still to the king who already chafed against his marriage. The contrast was too tempting. Anne of Cleves was tall, broad-shouldered, and reserved, struggling with the English language and the intricacies of Tudor courtliness. Catherine was petite, quick to smile, graceful in movement, and knew instinctively how to draw a man's gaze without seeming to reach for it. The court buzzed with masks, banquets, and dances that summer. Music spilled from the great halls, candles turned night into gold, and in every gathering, Henry's eyes found Catherine. His gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, softened in a way it had not for years. To the trained eyes of courtiers, this was more than idle curiosity. It was the first coil of a snare tightening. The Duke of Norfolk coached her with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Smile, but not too broadly. Speak only when he invites you. Appear innocent, but let him feel you understand him. Catherine followed the script as if born to it, not realizing that the stage she stepped onto was built over a trap door. By June, the political gears had turned with astonishing speed. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, the Queen quietly set aside with a generous settlement. Barely a month later, Catherine Howard, a girl who only months earlier had shared a narrow dormitory bed and whispered secrets by candlelight, was crowned Queen of England. To her family, it was a triumph. The Howards were back in the king's inner circle, their influence restored. But for Catherine, the crown was not a garland. It was a gilded collar, and the chain was already tightening around her throat. Part 3. The Gilded Cage. For a time, the world glittered. Catherine floated through it like a figure in a painted pageant, draped in crimson velvet and cloth of gold, her hair threaded with gems that caught the torchlight. She was a living emblem of renewal for a king desperate to prove his virility, a fresh blossom beside an aging trunk. Henry, flushed with the thrill of conquest, heaped treasures upon her, pearls that had once rested against Anne Boleyn's throat, rings that had clasped Jane Seymour's pale fingers. To him, they were tokens of romance. To the court, they were trophies recycled from women whose lives had ended in disgrace and blood. She glided through ceremonies like sunlight, spilling over polished marble. At audiences, she knelt gracefully before petitioners, pardoned prisoners with a gentle word, and interceded for the condemned in ways that made her seem both compassionate and powerful. Foreign envoys returned to their homelands speaking of England's young queen, lively, gracious, untouched by the weariness that had dulled so many before her. But the palace was no sanctuary. It was a labyrinth built from suspicion, its corridors lined with smiling mouths and listening ears. Servants bowed as they poured her wine, then vanished into the shadows to repeat her every word. Courtiers lingered too long at her side, not out of admiration, but calculation, weighing her influence, measuring her alliances, searching for cracks in her composure, her warmth. The very quality that had drawn Henry to her became dangerous currency in a market where gossip could be traded for power. A laugh at the wrong moment, a glance that lingered too long, any of it could be twisted into a story whispered into the king's ear. Beneath the brocade and ermine, Henry's body was rotting. The ulcer on his leg oozed and stank, a wound that refused to heal. His once athletic frame had swelled to the point that a hoist was needed to lift him onto his horse. At feasts, he could be roaring with laughter one moment, then hurling plates the next, his temper as unstable as his health. And always, there was the unspoken pressure, the demand for a son, an heir to secure the Tudor line. Each month that passed without the swelling of Catherine's belly was a silent warning, a shadow of past queens who had failed the same test. In the hush of her private chambers, beyond the music and the pageantry, Catherine must have felt the walls closing in. She had been placed on the throne as though seated upon a golden flower, but every petal of that flower was honed to a blade. The crown was hers, but so was the noose that came with it. Part 4. The Forbidden Flame. He was everything the king was not. Thomas Culpeper, young, broad-shouldered, with the restless vitality of a man who had never been told no, moved through the court with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere and owed nothing to anyone. His smile was quick, his laugh unguarded, his presence magnetic in a way that made men trust him and women linger in his shadow. As a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, he had the rare privilege of moving through the palace like water through stone, slipping past guards, stepping into rooms no one else dared enter, carrying messages and secrets between the most powerful people in England. He could pass into the Queen's apartments without raising so much as an eyebrow. At first, it was nothing. A pause in a crowded corridor, her eyes catching his and holding them just a fraction too long. A playful exchange in the garden, half hidden from the court, where their laughter wove together for a moment before dissolving into the murmur of polite conversation. Then came the letters, in Catherine's own hand, her words dangerous in their tenderness. It makes my heart to die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company. Each line was a thread binding them closer, each fold of parchment another nail in the coffin they could not yet see. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, became their bridge, a woman who had already survived the destruction of her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. She should have known better than to dance so close to the edge of the king's wrath. But perhaps she, too, felt the intoxication of being part of something forbidden. She carried their messages, arranged their meetings, closed the doors behind them with hands that shook only slightly. The encounters grew bolder, a brush of fingers in candlelight, a shared breath in a shadowed passage, conversations whispered in the stillness after midnight, when the rest of the palace lay in the fragile sleep of people afraid to dream too loudly. In those moments, the stench of Henry's festering wounds was gone. The weight of his age, the crushing gaze of his possessiveness, the suffocating air of the marriage, all of it fell away. In Culpeper's presence, Catherine was no longer the queen in a gilded cage. She was simply a girl again, her pulse quickening for reasons that had nothing to do with power. But in the Tudor court, secrets did not sleep for long. Behind the hangings and carved screens, there were always ears listening, always eyes watching. Somewhere in those echoing halls, a shadow was already bending low to whisper into the wrong ear. The flame they had kindled was small, but the air around them was dry as tinder, and it was already being fanned into a pyre. Part 5. The Blade in the Shadows. It began, as such deaths often did, with a whisper, a single breath of rumor, carried by a man whose faith outweighed his mercy. John Lascelles, reformer, opportunist, or both, brought his secret to Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. His sister, Mary Hall, had once served in the Dowager Duchess's household. She had seen the things Catherine believed buried forever. The stolen moments with Henry Manox, the reckless promises to Francis Derham, the intimate language of two young lovers who had called each other husband and wife. To Cranmer, this was not idle gossip. It was a sharpened blade, and in the right hands, it could gut the Howard faction in a single stroke. The Archbishop knew the stakes. A queen's disgrace was never hers alone. It was a wound to every ally she carried into the marriage. If he played this right, he could strike down not just Catherine, but the Catholic power base her family represented. Cranmer moved with the caution of a man carrying poison. He did not confront the king in council. That was too public, too volatile. Instead, he wrote a letter, a quiet dagger folded among the king's morning papers, its ink carrying accusations in measured, bloodless phrases. Every sentence was balanced between duty and treason, a careful dance to ensure that no matter how Henry reacted, Cranmer would not fall with her. When the king read the words, his face turned the color of old brick. At first, there was thunderous denial. His little Rose guilty? Impossible. But disbelief began to rot under the weight of memory. The times she had been absent, the glances exchanged with others, the moments he had dismissed as harmless. Denial curdled into suspicion, and suspicion fermented into a cold, steady fury. The hunt began. Francis Derham and Henry Manox were seized first. Dragged to the tower, they were broken on the rack, their limbs stretched until the joints screamed, and the truth, or something that resembled it, spilled from their mouths. Their confessions were sewn together into a damning tapestry. A queen whose reputation was stained long before she had worn the crown. Thomas Culpeper came next. The charm that had made him welcome in every chamber was stripped away under the agony of interrogation. He denied consummation, but the letters in Catherine's hand were proof enough to damn them both. Lady Rochford's fate was the cruelest. In the damp cold of her cell, her mind began to fracture, slipping into bouts of incoherent terror. In another time, madness might have been her shield. But Parliament had already decided otherwise. A new statute was passed. Insanity would no longer protect a traitor from the axe. Then came the Bill of Attainder, a death sentence inked on parchment, bypassing trial entirely. No jury, no defense, no chance. The Queen's fate was now a matter of law, her guilt decided without her voice ever being heard. In the corridors of Whitehall, her name was already spoken in the past tense. Courtiers adjusted their alliances, burned her letters, and pretended their loyalty had never leaned in her direction. Catherine Howard was still breathing, but in the eyes of the court, she was a ghost. And in the eyes of the law, she was already dead. Part 6. The Last Rehearsal. On the 14th of November, 1541, the Queen of England was locked inside her own chambers. The doors closed behind her with the quiet finality of a tomb. Servants were dismissed or replaced with strangers loyal only to the king. Ink, quills, and paper were taken away. Her voice silenced except through the mouths of her captors. Catherine's world shrank to a handful of rooms and the echo of her own thoughts. Some days, she spoke to no one. Others, she wept until she could no longer breathe. Food sat untouched. Sleep came in thin, broken hours. When at last she was sent to the Tower of London, the cruelty deepened. She was placed in the same chambers where Anne Boleyn, the king's second wife and her own cousin, had awaited execution 6 years before. The message was deliberate. You will follow her. In those final days, Catherine did something no queen had done before. She asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her room. The guards, baffled, obeyed. Alone, she knelt before it, placing her head upon the worn wood, lifting it, placing it again. She repeated the motion until it was perfect. She would not go to her death flailing and screaming. She would meet the blade with the precision of a dancer, hitting her final pose. To the men watching, it was chilling. To Catherine, it was the only control left to her, to decide how she would face the moment when the world would end. At night, she prayed for forgiveness, for mercy, for the souls of her servants. She dictated letters, brief, careful, denying the most damning charges, but admitting the failures that had led her here. She asked that her ladies be cared for after she was gone. She never asked for her own life. The city beyond the tower slept, unaware that in the darkness of its oldest prison, a 19-year-old girl was practicing how to die. Part 7. The Morning Without a Tomorrow. Dawn came pale and cold, a thin light spilling over the frost-bitten stones of the tower. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, its echo stretching over the frozen Thames. Catherine Howard, dressed in silence, a black velvet gown, a white linen coif framing her face. She looked less like a queen than a shadow of one. Guards flanked her as she stepped into the courtyard, the crunch of her shoes on the frozen ground the only sound in the world. The scaffold stood waiting, stark against the winter sky. The executioner, brought from France for his skill, stood ready, his sword already in hand. A small crowd gathered, tower officials, a handful of courtiers, her own ladies, pale with grief. No cheering mob, no jeering, just the heavy, suffocating weight of protocol. Catherine climbed the steps without faltering. She turned to face those assembled, her voice clear despite the chill. "I'd die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Some swore she never spoke those exact words. Others claimed they were the truest thing she ever said. What all agreed on was her composure. She asked for prayers for her soul, forgave those who had condemned her, and knelt without hesitation. She placed her head on the block exactly as she had practiced, steady, aligned, ready. A breath passed. The Frenchman's blade flashed. It was over in one stroke. They buried her within the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, a few paces from Anne Boleyn. No monument marked the spot. Only the cold stones of the tower remembered the girl who had once been Queen of England for 18 fleeting months. In Whitehall, Henry VIII carried on, hunting, feasting, laughing, as though she had never existed. But in the hushed corners of England, her name became a cautionary whisper, not about love, not about betrayal, but about the cost of being young, beautiful, and powerless in the shadow of a king.